Behind the cold concrete walls of America's most notorious prisons, a deadly power struggle has raged for decades. Brutal stabbings, calculated hits, and ruthless betrayals, all carried out in the name of survival and dominance. You've heard about La Eme, the Mexican mafia, ruthless enforcers who control entire prison blocks with an iron fist. You've learned about Nuestra Familia, the northern rebels who fought tooth and nail to challenge southern dominance. But there's one gang whose story is different, one born from revolution, not just revenge. This isn't just another prison gang story. It's the rise and fall of a brotherhood that started as a political movement, but soon drowned in violence, betrayal, and bloodshed. In 1966, inside the infamous San Quentin State Prison, a revolutionary was born. His name, George Jackson, a charismatic leader, an intellectual, and a man who believed that the prison system wasn't just a tool for punishment, but a weapon of oppression against Black Americans. Jackson founded the Black Guerrilla Family, not as a gang, but as a movement, a brotherhood built on Marxist and revolutionary principles, fighting against systemic racism and injustice within the prison system. But it didn't take long for ideology to collide with reality. The same system Jackson wanted to fight would turn his vision into something darker, a ruthless criminal empire that traded political ideals for power, drugs, and violence. As the years passed, the Black Guerrilla Family evolved from a revolutionary force into a gang synonymous with fear and power inside California's most dangerous prisons. The organization built an empire on drug trafficking, extortion, and assassination, rivaling other prison giants like La Eme and the Aryan Brotherhood. But with power came betrayal, internal power struggles, deadly hits, and alliances broken by greed would lead to the gang's violent downfall. This is the story of how a movement born from oppression became one of the deadliest criminal organizations in American history, and how that empire began to crumble from the inside. From revolutionary beginnings to blood-soaked betrayals, this is the rise and fall of the Black Guerrilla Family. But before we dive into their brutal downfall, we need to go back to the very beginning, to a prison yard in San Quentin, where one man's dream of revolution would soon spiral into a nightmare of violence and death. The story of the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, cannot be told without diving deep into the life of George Jackson, a man whose legacy is equal parts revolutionary, intellectual, and violent. His life, shaped by systemic oppression, criminality, and radical ideology, became the foundation for one of the most feared and politically motivated prison gangs in U.S. history. George Lester Jackson was born on September 23, 1941, in Chicago, Illinois. His family was part of the great wave of African Americans who migrated from the South to northern cities during the early to mid-20th century, seeking better opportunities and escaping the entrenched racism of Jim Crow laws. Jackson's upbringing was troubled from the start. His father, Lester Jackson, worked as a postal worker, while his mother, Georgia B. Jackson, tried to keep the family together in difficult circumstances. Despite his parents' efforts to provide a stable home, Jackson's early years were defined by poverty, racial discrimination, and systemic marginalization. Growing up as a black child in 1940s Chicago meant constant exposure to racism, limited economic opportunities, and violence. In his teenage years, the family relocated to Los Angeles, California, settling in the Watts neighborhood, a notoriously impoverished and racially segregated area. It was here that Jackson began to drift toward the streets. The environment was hostile and unforgiving, with police harassment and racial tension shaping much of Jackson's teenage experience. By the time he was in his mid-teens, Jackson had already begun to rebel against authority. He started engaging in petty crimes, mostly shoplifting, vandalism, and minor thefts. It wasn't long before he fell in with local street gangs. While there's no solid evidence that Jackson officially joined a specific gang, like the Crips or Bloods, which didn't fully form until later in the 1960s, he was deeply involved in criminal circles common in south-central Los Angeles during the late 1950s. These informal neighborhood gangs were often loosely organized, built around shared geography, race, and mutual protection from law enforcement and rival groups. Jackson's early criminal activities escalated as he aged. By the time he was 18, he had been arrested several times for various offenses, including assault and theft. His path toward deeper criminal involvement became inevitable as poverty and systemic oppression limited his opportunities for education and employment. In 1960, at just 18 years old, Jackson committed the crime that would define the rest of his life. Alongside an accomplice, Jackson attempted to rob a gas station in Los Angeles. The amount stolen was minor. Reports suggest it was only about $70. But the severity of the crime, armed robbery with a deadly weapon, meant that Jackson was facing serious consequences. During his trial, Jackson's defense argued that this was a petty crime and that he deserved leniency. However, the judge saw him as a habitual offender due to his prior arrests and sentenced him to 1 year to life in prison, a deeply controversial sentence that reflected the harsh nature of California's indeterminate sentencing laws at the time. This law allowed judges and parole boards to keep prisoners incarcerated indefinitely based on their behavior and perceived threat level. Jackson was sent to Soledad Prison, and it was there that his life took a dramatic and radical turn. Prison was a crucible for George Jackson. While incarcerated, he underwent a complete intellectual and ideological transformation. Initially entering prison as an angry, disillusioned young man with no real sense of direction, Jackson began to educate himself through relentless reading. He consumed the works of revolutionary thinkers like Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, Frantz Fanon, Mao Zedong, and Che Guevara. Through these writings, Jackson found clarity and purpose. He became a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary, viewing the prison system as a direct extension of the oppressive, racist structures that controlled American society. His belief was that prisons weren't just for punishing crime. They were tools of institutionalized racial oppression designed to suppress and control minority populations, particularly Black Americans. By 1966, Jackson had transformed from a petty criminal into a revolutionary thinker and charismatic leader within the prison system. Alongside fellow inmates W.L. Nolan and James Carr, Jackson co-founded the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, inside San Quentin State Prison. The original goals of the BGF: promote Black power and Marxist ideology. The BGF was rooted in revolutionary principles aimed at overthrowing what they saw as a corrupt capitalist system built on racial oppression. Protect Black inmates. They provided physical protection for Black inmates from racist prison gangs, like the Aryan Brotherhood and other hostile inmate groups. Eradicate white supremacy. The BGF openly opposed the racist structures of the prison system and often engaged in violent confrontations with white supremacist gangs. But as time went on, the revolutionary message of the BGF became entangled with criminal activities. Drug trafficking, extortion, and murder became central to their operations, leading to the organization's evolution from a political group into a violent prison gang. Jackson's rise within the BGF came with a wave of violence that would define his final years in prison. In 1969, his close friend and co-founder, W.L. Nolan, was killed during a prison yard riot by prison guards at Soledad Prison. This event radicalized Jackson even further and fueled the BGF's desire for revenge. In retaliation, Jackson allegedly ordered the assassination of a prison guard, John Mills, who was found beaten and thrown from a third-tier balcony in 1970. Though Jackson was never convicted for the murder, authorities believed he had orchestrated the attack as retribution for Nolan's death. In 1970, Jackson published Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson, a collection of his letters from prison that detailed his thoughts on systemic race and class struggle and prison conditions. The book became a bestseller and turned Jackson into a symbol of resistance for civil rights activists and left-wing revolutionaries across the world. His writings inspired countless activists, including members of the Black Panther Party, who viewed Jackson as a political prisoner rather than a criminal. However, as his influence grew, so did his enemies, both inside and outside prison walls. Jackson's revolutionary life ended violently on August 21, 1971, in what became known as the San Quentin Prison escape attempt. Jackson smuggled a handgun into the prison, allegedly provided by his attorney, Stephen Bingham. His goal was to take hostages and negotiate the release of several inmates. The escape attempt turned into a bloodbath. 3 guards and 2 inmates were killed. Jackson himself was shot and killed by a prison guard as he attempted to flee across the prison yard. His death ignited riots and protests across the country, cementing Jackson's status as a martyr for some and a dangerous revolutionary for others. The BGF's Revolutionary Foundation immediately put them at odds with many prison factions. Here's why their list of enemies was so long. Ideological conflict. The BGF was rooted in Marxist-Leninist beliefs, promoting black liberation and overthrowing systemic oppression. Their radical stance made them an ideological threat to racist groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, and created friction with gangs focused purely on crime and power. Racial tensions. The BGF aimed to protect black inmates and directly opposed white supremacist gangs, particularly the Aryan Brotherhood. Their pro-black stance also put them in competition with La Eme, which had a stronghold among Latino inmates. Territorial control. Inside prisons, control over drug trafficking, gambling, and extortion operations often fueled violent rivalries. The BGF's efforts to control certain prison economies brought them into conflict with La Eme and Nuestra Familia, who also vied for dominance. The Aryan Brotherhood, AB, founded in San Quentin State Prison in 1964, was a violent white supremacist gang that became one of the BGF's deadliest enemies. From the beginning, their ideologies were fundamentally opposed. BGF fought systemic racism, while AB thrived on it. In 1970, George Jackson's close friend and fellow BGF member, W.L. Nolan, was shot and killed by prison guards during a violent yard fight involving white inmates, believed to be influenced by the Aryan Brotherhood. Enraged by the death of Nolan, Jackson allegedly ordered the assassination of John Mills, a prison guard suspected of involvement in Nolan's killing. Mills was beaten, mutilated, and thrown from a third-tier tier at Soledad Prison, a clear act of revenge. Impact. The killing of Mills escalated racial tensions inside California prisons, particularly between the BGF and Aryan Brotherhood. This marked the start of a brutal back-and-forth feud that resulted in countless inmate murders over the 2 decades. On August 21, 1971, George Jackson was shot and killed during an attempted escape from San Quentin State Prison. Jackson allegedly smuggled in a handgun and initiated a hostage-taking scenario to negotiate the release of fellow BGF members. During the failed escape attempt, Jackson and his accomplices killed 3 prison guards and 2 inmates, including those suspected of collaborating with rival gangs. Jackson was fatally shot by a guard while trying to escape across the yard. Impact. Jackson's death became a rallying cry for BGF members, intensifying their violence against Aryan Brotherhood and La Eme. It also cemented Jackson's legacy as a martyr, fueling further retaliatory killings within the prison system. The 1970s and 1980s saw one of the deadliest chapters in California prison history, a brutal war fought between the BGF, Aryan Brotherhood, and La Eme. What sparked the war? La Eme sought to expand its control over drug trafficking and extortion in California prisons, leading to frequent clashes with the BGF. The Aryan Brotherhood formed an alliance with La Eme based on shared economic interests and mutual hatred of black inmates. The BGF, defending black prisoners and their own territory, became the primary target of this alliance. The Folsom Prison Massacre, 1971. A turning point. One of the deadliest incidents in this prison war occurred at Folsom Prison. A coordinated attack was launched by Aryan Brotherhood and La Eme members during a yard session. Several BGF members were ambushed and killed in retaliations for earlier attacks orchestrated by the BGF. The massacre solidified a temporary alliance between La Eme and the Aryan Brotherhood, 2 groups that otherwise despised each other, proving how far they were willing to go to destroy the BGF. The prison war's fallout. Over the next decade, hundreds of inmates were killed or injured in retaliatory strikes across California's prison system. The violence forced prison officials to implement extreme segregation policies, attempting to isolate gang members from one another. Though the BGF and La Eme didn't share ideological rivalries like the Aryan Brotherhood, they were locked in a brutal war for control over prison drug trafficking, extortion, and influence. Following George Jackson's death in 1971, La Eme took advantage of the BGF's period of mourning and internal weakness. Inmates loyal to La Eme initiated a violent assault on BGF members at San Quentin Prison. Multiple BGF members were stabbed and beaten in what was seen as an attempt to eliminate the group's influence. Impact. This incident ignited a series of retaliatory strikes from the BGF against La Eme across multiple California prisons. It deepened the racial and territorial divide inside the prison system, making peaceful coexistence impossible. Despite both having rivalries with La Eme, the BGF and Nuestra Familia, NF, were not allies. While both opposed La Eme, competition over drug trafficking routes and alliances led to violent encounters between the 2 groups. In 1976, tensions erupted between the BGF and Nuestra Familia at Soledad Prison. BGF attempted to extend their drug trafficking operations into NF-controlled territories within the prison. Nuestra Familia retaliated launching a coordinated attack on BGF affiliates during mealtime, resulting in multiple stabbings. Impact. This incident fueled hostilities between the two gangs, despite their shared opposition to La Eme. Future conflicts between BGF and Nuestra Familia were less frequent, but equally violent when they occurred, often revolving around control of prison economies. The Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, began as a radical movement aimed at liberating black prisoners from systemic oppression. But over time, it became one of the most notorious criminal organizations operating inside and outside of prison walls. After decades of bloody wars with La Eme, Nuestra Familia, and the Aryan Brotherhood, as well as power struggles within its own ranks, the BGF's influence has changed dramatically. While the gang is far from extinct, its downfall can be traced to several key factors: law enforcement crackdowns, internal betrayals, and the erosion of its revolutionary ideology. Today, the BGF exists in a fragmented state, with splinter groups operating in different regions, particularly in California and Maryland. Let's break down. When George Jackson was killed during his failed 1971 San Quentin escape, the BGF lost its most charismatic and ideological leader. Jackson was the driving force behind the gang's original vision, a revolutionary group built to protect black prisoners and fight systemic oppression. After his death, the BGF faced a major identity crisis. Some members still wanted to follow Jackson's Marxist-Leninist ideology, focusing on revolutionary change. Others saw the BGF as a criminal organization, looking to expand drug trafficking, extortion, and smuggling operations. This internal split weakened the gang from within. Some members were still committed to political activism, while others became ruthless career criminals more interested in making money. The BGF spent too much time at war, not just with one gang, but with almost every major prison gang in California. La Eme, Mexican Mafia, over drug trafficking and racial tensions. Aryan Brotherhood, racial supremacy and power struggles. Nuestra Familia, competing for influence inside prisons. Crips and Bloods, disputes over street-level operations. Fighting this many wars stretched BGF thin. They were constantly losing members, leaders, and control over key prison economies. By the late 1980s, both La Eme and the Aryan Brotherhood had solidified their control over drug distribution networks in California prisons. The BGF, once a dominant force, was losing its grip on power. The 1990s, 2010s saw massive federal investigations targeting the BGF. These operations decimated the gang's leadership and disrupted their ability to control operations inside and outside of prison. Major law enforcement operations that took down BGF leaders. Operation Black, August 1995-1999. Named after George Jackson's Black August movement. This FBI operation dismantled BGF leadership inside Pelican Bay State Prison. Many high-ranking members were isolated in security housing units, SHU, cutting off their ability to communicate with members on the streets. Operation Black Widow, 2001-2003. This was aimed at Nuestra Familia, but it also exposed BGF's weakened state. Intercepted messages showed that the BGF had lost much of its influence inside prison and was struggling to compete with Nuestra Familia and La Eme. Baltimore crackdown, 2010s, 2014. In Maryland, the BGF had expanded its influence in Baltimore, running heroin distribution inside Baltimore City Detention Center. In 2013, a federal sting took down Tavon White, a BGF lieutenant who was secretly running the jail and had relationships with female prison guards smuggling drugs for him. Result: these crackdowns devastated the BGF's leadership, making it harder for the gang to maintain strict control over its members. One of the biggest reasons for the BGF's downfall was internal snitching. High-ranking BGF members flipped under pressure, giving law enforcement inside information. Informants wore wires and helped set up key leaders, leading to multiple life sentences for BGF higher-ups. One of the biggest betrayals came from BGF members cooperating with the FBI in the early 2000s. These snitches exposed BGF's secret communication networks and led to dozens of high-profile arrests. Result: the BGF lost trust in its own members, and paranoia spread among the gang. So, what's left of the Black Guerrilla Family? While the gang still exists, it is nowhere near as powerful as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. Here's what we know about the current state of the BGF. BGF's power inside California prisons is diminished. La Eme and Nuestra Familia have taken over most of the drug trade in California prisons. Many BGF members have been pushed into SNY, sensitive needs yards, where they are isolated from general population. Older members are aging out, and younger black inmates often choose to align with Crips, Bloods, or other groups instead of BGF. 2. The BGF is more active in Maryland and the East Coast. While their California power is fading, the BGF still has a presence in Maryland, Baltimore, and the East Coast. The gang is involved in heroin and fentanyl trafficking, particularly in Baltimore. 3 internal splinter groups because of mass incarcerations and leadership losses. The BGF no longer operates under one unified leadership. Different sets of BGF have formed, leading to internal conflicts. Once feared inside California's prisons, the BGF is now a fragmented organization struggling to survive. George Jackson's revolutionary dream is long gone. The gang today operates more like a criminal syndicate than a political movement. Their presence in California prisons has been severely weakened due to mass incarceration of leaders and the rise of more powerful prison gangs like La Eme and Nuestra Familia. On the streets, the BGF still operates in Baltimore and parts of the East Coast, but they are no longer the dominant force they once were. The Black Guerrilla Family started as a revolutionary movement, one that promised to protect black inmates and fight against systemic oppression. But over time, the lines blurred. Ideology gave way to violence, loyalty was betrayed, and what was once a movement became just another criminal empire, one that, like so many before it, collapsed under the weight of its own bloodshed. From the brutal prison wars with La Eme and the Aryan Brotherhood, to government crackdowns, snitches, and betrayals, what was once one of the most feared gangs in the California prison system is now a shadow of its former self. Today, the BGF still clings to survival, its influence shifting to the East Coast, where it remains involved in drug trafficking and organized crime. But the question remains, will the Black Guerrilla Family ever rise again? Or is this the final chapter in a gang that once claimed to be more than just criminals? What do you think? Is the Black Guerrilla Family truly finished? Or is it just waiting for its next resurgence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into prison gang history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. We've got more stories coming, stories that expose the dark underworld of organized crime, like never before. And if you like this, you're going to love our next video, where we uncover the rise and fall of another deadly prison empire. Click here to watch now.